Welcome everyone, I'm Jülide. I'm a senior student at this high school and I'm going to talk a bit about education. You may be wondering what I'm doing here as a speaker among all of the successful, empowered women whom we are lucky to have here speaking at this event. I also questioned what makes me eligible to talk about education, right? Well, it's not any particular skill or expertise that I have. I have just as much to tell as you. But I hold this opinion. I think the very situation in which a student thinks just because she's a student, she is nothing worthy of saying about education, implies a lot about how accustomed we as students have become to our opinions being overlooked about things that are actually going to shape our future. That's one of the problems policymakers in education tend to overlook, to leave out, listening to the narrative of the students. Which is why I'm going to talk about a particular model of education, one that cherishes individual opinions, one that arose from the ideal of providing equal opportunities to everyone, and one that challenged the traditional system, village institutes. As many of you probably already know, village institutes was among the first educational projects of the Republican regime in Turkey. It was an experimental alternative which adopted a policy of transforming knowledge into work. Let's imagine Turkey at the end of the 1930s, a country that has been recovering from tireless wars and currently in a threatening environment of an upcoming one. Educational opportunities are only available for the economically advantaged, who mainly live in cities. 75% of the population, however, live in rural areas where literacy rates are almost non-existent. Derived from the need of providing education for the bulk of the Republic, Atatürk employs Saffet Arıkan as the Minister of Education and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç as the Director General of Primary Education. With an idea of raising teachers for village schools, the first educationist center in Eskişehir was established in 1936 as an initial step of what we will later call village institutes. In 1938, Saffet Arıkan was replaced by Hasan Ali Yücel, with whom the journey of village institutes had officially started. Yücel divided the country in 21 separate areas according to different agricultural and geographical factors. With the coming into force of the Village Institutes Law in the 17th of April 1940, 21 schools were constructed for each of these districts. Yücel and Tonguç envisioned a system where education met application. How? Well, half of the curriculum consisted of general education and the other half was applications, a quarter specifically spared for agricultural training. Students were taught modern agricultural techniques while also producing food for their own. Sustainable production integrated in education. Isn't this all we dream about today? The other half of applicational training was technical. Options available varied according to genders. Male students were taught more physically laboring crafts such as carpentry, symmetry, and machinery, whereas domestic jobs like handicraft, tailoring, and cooking were suited to girls. More on that later on. Alternative applications also ranged according to locational standards. For schools that were close to the seashore, navigational training was also an option, for instance. Each institute had its program shaped specifically for its students' regional circumstances and needs. That's what I love about them. Education wasn't about some unrealistic details which students would have to memorize just to be called educated. They learned about what they were going to be occupied with in the future. They were taught how to exercise things they have learned in the classroom. Now, in the beginning, I've mentioned listening to the narrative of the students and praised village institutes for valuing individual opinion. Institutes saw teachers and students as equals. Students had the right to criticize the teachers, administrators, and applications they have had any problems with. This was done during what was called assessment days on Saturdays, when students and teachers made their remarks about the previous week and discussed ways to progress. everyone was given the chance to clarify or defend themselves if any criticism was made against them. On one very famous occasion, President İsmet İnönü paid a visit to one of the institutes and at lunch was offered a special meal, different from what the students ate that day. Later in that week, during the assessment day, the school principal was highly criticized by the students for making exemptions. He explained the situation, stating that İnönü had a diabetic problem, hence he had gotten special treatment, and made his defense by pointing out that students who have health-related problems also get different meals according to their diets. Well, whether you accept the principal's apology or not, this is a great example that shows the institutes had a working democratic system which encouraged children to speak up, no matter against who, and ensured them that their opinions matter. One of the problems the institutes faced was the enrollment of students, girls in particular. These schools were specifically meant for children living in rural areas whose parents needed them as assistants in their work in farming and agriculture. Given the economic conditions of the times, parents were reluctant to send their boys off, and for girls, I think you can imagine only how unconventional even the concept of education was. In an attempt to challenge the unconventional, teachers visited door to door to encourage locals for the education of their daughters. And boys who applied with a fellow female students were exempt from pre-evaluation for admission to the institutes. Unfortunately, despite the efforts, the attendance of girls were drastically low. The highest ratio achieved was in 1946, where out of a total of over 15,000 students, only 11% were girls. This brings me back to another problem with our education today. Gender parity is emblematic of any educational drawback. Official statistics show that today there are over 2 million people older than 15 years of age who are illiterate. 86% of them are women. Almost 3 million people have not officially received any formal education. Approximately 600,000 of them are male, compared to the nearly 2 million who are female. Now again, relying on official data, we've also come a long way in terms of gender parity in schooling. In the last 20 years, the ratio of boys and girls enrolled in primary and secondary education has roughly evened out. But the problem is, officials in education tend to take this as an end game towards reaching gender equality, where it's actually far from it. We can't reach equality solely with numbers. In this sense, village institutes could be criticized with the same understanding. I feel it is necessary to note that gender roles also define some of the applications taught in the curriculums. When talking about the institutes, the separation of girls and boys in application is usually overlooked for the sake of not disrespecting the value of the educational revolution that it carries. But I think, if not for anything, for what the village institutes had envisioned, we should take a moment to criticize this choice of curriculums too. Remember how I just mentioned that the applicative lessons taught to female students were reduced to domestic applications? What did this tell about the role of women in society? The aim was highly revisionist compared to the mentality of the times, building a prototype of an educated woman in the family. For rural circumstances in the 1940s, this prototype is perhaps understandably convenient. But from today's perspective, we should challenge convenience, just as we must challenge our current education curriculum's teachings on gender perspectives. This criticism, however, should not overshadow the institutors' relentless efforts to preserve hybrid education of boys and girls against the conservative backlash from within political circles. One of the main goals of providing education in villages was, in the first place, to achieve gender equality in society. Sadly, this was also one of the biggest factors that led to the village institute's eventual shutdown. Opposition from within Congress, backed by the feudal powers of the rural areas, did not approve of women being educated and partaking in civil life. They argued that boys and girls cohabiting in the same institutions was inappropriate and against the moral values of the people. But Perihan Güller, a female institute graduate, states otherwise. In an interview to Semiha Tuna in her work Being a Woman in the Village Institutes, Güller recounts that it was not the people, but the landlords and politicians who opposed girls, and that the girls were actually always embraced by the locals. This account alone shows us the transforming effect the institutes can have on society. This transforming effect, perhaps, was why they couldn't resist opposition. Village institutes deconstructed the dogma of girls not being worthy of education. It deconstructed the system where teachers represented sole authority rather than providing guidance to their students. It deconstructed the idea that education was for the elite in the cities and not for the children of the countryside. It was ended because it had yet to deconstruct. Today, we also have yet to deconstruct. Thank you.